Okay.
Good afternoon. Always great to speak right after lunch. So I'll wait if anything really neat comes up. Don't worry about that. As Andy says, I've been around longer than the society.
Page down
I look like it.
Okay.
and
I was
page
going
up.
to try to see if I
Page
could
down
get
goes
a
forward, page up goes back.
Okay.
I'll be right back.
Okay.
Can't bring my words up sometimes. I was going to try to see if I could get a picture of myself as I looked in 1979 when we started this thing to show you what the office of the director. They always said the president of the United States age is 20 years and he's 4 to 8 years. I'd be part of this group. But some of you may have seen a very similar title pop up on the screen before. And you would never identify the speaker at that time. I think, well, maybe they're the same guy. Colonel Ralph Barger was working on this project for many, many years, well before, well, not this project, but he's been working on passenger car research, most especially the Pullman Company, since he got out of the Army. And he stand here 3 times and still not come to the same balance with me on the side. Ralph was built like a stick. I had the very good fortune of meeting Colonel Barger right after the society got started. He found out, I don't know how, that I had an interest in passenger equipment, and that I was trying to gather information on the B&O's car fleet. Those of you that were paying attention to the B&O at the time might know that the available research on the B&O consisted of Hungerford's 2-volume centenary or centenary work, Public Relations 101. The early work by a citizen of Baltimore about the history of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. That, of course, also a company man that wrote that, but very hard to find. You can get it in various libraries. Now it's online on some of the book services. Power by Larry Sable and his earlier work, the history of the locomotives, but not much having to do with the car fleets. So I had started working with the B&O Museum before we had a society to try to gather information out of their archives. I had the very good fortune to meet Howard Barr, who has been working there, I think, since he was 15, and learned a great deal from Mr. Barr. When Ralph got a hold of me, he said, how about coming by one night and I'll show you what I'm doing. He was publishing what was supposed to have been a 5-volume history of the Pullman car in America. He got through the first
That didn't come up. I
volume
didn't see it.
published by Greenberg
Yeah.
Publishing, and it listed all of the Pullman cars that he was going to be detailing in the next 4 volumes. I managed to get out the 2nd volume, which I helped a bit on, which was the wooden cars. The steel car manuscript was right virtually ready to go, but he ran into some problems getting the permission from the Smithsonian to use the Pullman car photographs that he had already purchased, and they wouldn't give him permission to publish. That's why he decided he would talk to me, since I was affiliated with the Smithsonian at the time. I had absolutely no influence whatsoever. And that project kind of came to a halt. Those of you that might know Ralph might know that he had a stubborn spirit. And when he decided that something had to happen, event A had to happen before event B, it wasn't going to happen until event A happened. And that just completely stopped that Pullman car project. Very unfortunate for the Pullman car students in America. Very, very fortunate for the B&O Historical Society, because he had been compiling information on the Pullman-built cars of the major passenger hauling railroad, the New York Central, B&O, the C&O, Pennsylvania, of course, Santa Fe. And he had volumes of information on that subject. Combining what he had done with the stuff I had done, we started to really look at it as possibly enough material to cover the subject. Later, we got William Barringer, Bill Barringer, Catonsville together, who used to work at Mount Clair, and he too had quite a trove of photographs. And most recently being maybe 35 years ago, Bill House, the former vice president of C&O, Jesse, for casualty prevention, who had been the last C&O's car manager, or being a passenger services manager before Amtrak, and had been very influential on C&O's participation in Amtrak, as well as he was a director of the Pullman Company. So another very, very nice resource to deal with. So our work continued to get enhanced, and when I get to showing you this in a few minutes or a couple minutes, I think you'll see some of how this came about. Ralph and I worked on the dining car rosters and photographs and assorted memorabilia about the dining car fleet for about 15 years together. And at that time, I unfortunately was still employed by my wonderful uncle, Sam, who decided that he needed to cut most of his resources in several areas. This was during the Reagan administration, and health was not their key issue. Mr. Reagan believed that that should be done by the states. So I, being in public health, cut my staff down by about a third. There were no new people coming, and almost from then until about 10 years ago, we never got any new employees. So 50, 60 hour weeks were common. And I was not able to work with Ralph anymore. That didn't stop Ralph. And I made a profile, and I started this. It was the sleeping cars that we were working on. That was supposed to be the first project, sleeping cars. So Ralph decided to put a stake in that and say, that's a project that he and I are doing. And he started on the B&O dining cars and other food services. His number one backup, his number one researcher and assistant, cook and bottle washer, was his wife, and as he called her, the chief of staff of Fort Barker. The two of them continued his work until Mrs. Barber passed away. Subsequent to that, I saw a big change around. And while his interest never waned, his attention to detail started to just get a little bit shaky, and that was a big distraction. Still, I was unable to jump back in and spend much time. Started taking more time to go see him. Then again, another change in my employment status with the federal government, and I had to really cut off all my contact with that. That's why I disappeared here from society as well. I mean, work was what it was all about. By the time I was able to start getting back together with him, he was quite ill. You wouldn't know it to see him. He looked fine, but he wasn't. And he stopped answering his telephone. He ultimately moved out of his home with a caregiver and support giver and very, very important person in his life. She didn't answer the phone for him either. So we kind of lost contact. Project was on the vine. Now I'm getting ready to retire. And I get a call from Greg Smith, and we start talking. And it turned out that this was about the time that Ralph died. We went to Arlington Cemetery for his ceremonies. And met two of his three children there, all of whom I knew, but hadn't seen in quite a few years. And his younger daughter was running the estate. And she asked me what in the world was she going to do with all this stuff. He had promised his Pullman car files to the California State Railroad Museum. And they said, if you want us to take it, you have to ship it out here on your nickel. And you have to pay for its maintenance here at the State Museum. That wasn't going to happen. Enter the B&O RRPS. He had already promised us his B&O material, but that word had probably not quite reached Carol. And then, when it did, she was more than happy to work with us. And as a result, cutting through a whole lot of history through here, because you don't want to sit and listen to all that. Not only did we obtain Ralph's collection, but we have his Pullman collection and collection on, I think, about 13 or 14 other railroads as well. And a few, those of you that are here in the building, if you want to wander back to the library, you'll notice that on the back, the window wall, there's a very large cabinet or very large closet that was built by Grant Berry to take care of Ralph's collection of B&O. And then across the room from there, at least a 3 times bigger cabinet that has all of his other work. That's just the photographs. That's just the photographs. And we also have his files. Some of them are in our vault, our secured vault. Others are downstairs in the main stacks. At this point, they're not all cataloged yet, so we don't talk too much about them, but they're there. And his work is preserved, and we are custodians. So Greg asked me if I would be interested in picking up where we left off. In a weak moment, I said, well, why not? Let's do that. But in memory of Ralph, I decided that we should start with the dining cars because that's what he and his wife have been working on. And that should be his memorial edition. Dining cars, food service cars, and theater. These are working titles because we keep finding things. Ralph had a very, very limited but comprehensive idea of what he wanted in that book. And basically, let me stop here and share a very short misery with you. I came in here this morning, put my memory stick into the computer workstation that I use every week on Thursday in here, and reviewed my presentation. Everything looked fine. I found 2 more things that I decided to put into it, added them in, saved them, closed down the workstation. And then when I went to put them in here, the stick is corrupted. Everything was tied. I couldn't get to anything that was on the stick. So I got in touch with our many membered IT staff right back here. And in the course of taking care of or trying to see what he could find, it was necessary to reformat the stick, therefore it's gone. So I spent much time putting together this presentation, and it looks like it. This is the 20-minute version of my 40-hour presentation that I had built. Let's have a slide, Andy. Start. What I want to show you today is not the book, because the book is presented where it is. The research is done, except that in a couple of weeks, something else comes up.
Let me get hold of Nick. It's not doing it.
Oh, Chris is right there.
Page down, page up. Use the arrows.
The arrows.
Little technical
I
difficulty.
can't remember if it was arrow down or arrow left.
Okay.
One or the other.
My technical team is working out the posts.
This is PowerPoint, right? Yep.
It's not moving.
That should be above the key.
My chief of IT services mentioned to me that when he shows up, everything I do goes to I'm very close. Maybe
The arrows are on the screen, Chris. If you move the cursor, you'll see the little white, there at the bottom left.
bottom left.
Oh, there they are, yeah.
See? They're half hidden.
Oh,
Okay, good. I see it now.
there, use them. The problem was that you see the Zoom has got the focus.
Yeah.
So that's why the keyboard's not working,
Keyboard's not working. Right.
but use them.
Okay.
And you'll be in good
One of
shape.
the things that Ralph.
Is that the first one?
Yeah, it's
Yes.
first.
Okay.
One of the things that Ralph had decided before he took on a co-author was that the book would contain passenger cars up from, or, well, he also envisioned an entire series of these books. Therefore, the passenger cars would be enough, but the dining car book would contain any food service car that was on the roster in 1940, January 1, 1940, we have those rosters, all the way to Amtrak. So the older cars were not going to be there, and no amount of conversation with me could ever shake him. The other thing he had decided was that the format was going to be a photograph at the top of the page, a diagram at the bottom of the page,
Zoom has control.
and
So
information
the arrow keys are.
assigning the cars, listing the cars, breaking the roster up by class primarily, with the dates and other information. You'll see a slide here in just a minute. But that was pretty much what he wanted. He didn't want to have any information in there about the dining service itself. But my conversations in the field, and Ralph was every bit as active as I was that people really wanted a little bit more. So in these memorials, I'm going to preserve his idea. It is January 1940 through the end of service, but I am going to include a historical section on it that talks about the dining cars, because we didn't even have any dining cars in this country until after the Civil War. It was unheard of. Remember, the railroads were based on the old post coaches, and they stopped every some number of hours at an inn or a way station, and they 10 minutes for lunch or 15 minutes for dinner. The dining car came out with Pullman when he came out with something called a restaurant car. All of that in detail, I'm not going to touch it today. I do have on my no longer existent presentation, an older car than this. We have a Waldorf, which was one of the Royal Blue dining cars, and the sister car was the Queen. And we have both the exterior photographs, we have a diagram, and we have a couple of interior shots, and they're very nice. In that, there is a view of the gas plating fixtures, glass, which is gas, was used. And I happened to find a photograph of the B&O's Pince glass manufacturing plant, which is in B&O in Baltimore, 2019. So I'm going to repeat that when I talk in that historical section. Then we'll get into the classed cars. Oh, okay. This is a diagram of the F3 dining car, which were 1025 to 1028, and what happened to them. The information lines will show you that two of them became class F3B, one became an F3A, and that one car, number 1027, was never modified, and it was retired in 1956. And there she is, right there, on the left. That's the 1027. You notice that it has the arched windows. This car actually came from the come on, I'm gonna blank on you now. On the Pittsburgh and one of the short lines that got folded in. You know, got the wrong notes here now for this presentation. That's sitting in the D yard at Mount Clair in 1956. And the car coupled to it was a cafe parlor car. I can't make out the number, but it was definitely in the 2000s. And you can see the windows are gone. Everybody assumes this means they're on their way to scrap. It's also possible they're on their way to maintenance way service, because they pretty well gutted the cars and then rebuilt the exteriors to support the maintenance of way. But we'll have that information for you in the book. Okay, Andrew. The number 1032 is another of the F. This is that's also an F3. Just to show that once it also shows you the original paint scheme of the modern era, which was an all green car, no stripes. The diner number was over the wheel set, right over the truck. And it actually had the word dining car spelled out in the middle. You also see that from the vent pipes in here that this car, originally at least, didn't even have steam and heat. It was a stove heated car. Andy, please remember that this was done in 25 minutes. I'm not very proud of it. Here is a cafe parlor car. The cafe would be in the front section to the right. Let's say to the right section here. The parlor section would be over here to the left. And then the small windows and the single window in between is where the kitchen facilities would have been.
What's the number, Joe?
It is 1095. Later, all these cars became 2000s, but this was pre that renumbering. Okay, Andy. We get to the F4B, the colonial dining car. I put this slide in here primarily because this is an as-built colonial diner. You notice on the 6 dining room windows on each side that there are 3 sections to the window. The 2 outside sections were stained glass, or at least leaded colored glass. I don't know that it really qualified as stained glass. Over top of the middle section, there are 8 small glass panes, so referred to as Queen Anne glass. The kitchen windows, as built, they could actually be open, which is very unusual. No air conditioning. This was the pride of the fleet. This was the B&O's attempt. And interestingly enough, when the book is finished, you'll see that the F3, F4Bs, and the F4Cs are covered together because they're basically identical cars. The only difference that I've been able to find was the interior, which was completely different, and this treatment of the windows. Everything else, they were basically a standard car. And while I was speaking of standard car, Pullman actually had a catalog of dining cars. So a prototype or a model would be picked, and then the railroad would spec how they wanted it done. Did they want the windows paired? Did they want them bay windows like these are, or the special windows? How would the interior be done? In many cases, the interiors were done back by the Baltimore and Ohio after they got the cars. I don't know that that was the case on any of the Colonials. And the most unbelievable fact to me, but I've seen the reference to it numerous times, is that an F4C and an F4B, as delivered, cost the same. I don't know how they got all the wood trim and special fittings and Heppel white chairs and all that nice stuff, which we'll detail in the book for you, at the same price that they got your basic standard railroad furnishings. But it's claimed in at least 3 B&O source publications. So, all right, Andy. The next car that we show here is the Martha Washington. This is actually one of the first 2 colonial diners delivered. The B&O was buying diners in 2s and 4s, pretty much as they had the money more than anything else. these two cars, the Martha Washington, and the other car was called the Mount Vernon, because the original intent of the Colonials was to name it for events in George Washington's environment. If it had something to do with Washington. By the time the next cars were delivered, they had changed their mind and decided to name them all after colonial names. So Martha Washington kept her name. The Mount Vernon became Betty Zane. We will have a section in the book, and again, forgive me, Colonel, that explain who all of these various women are. Some of them were pretty hard to find, but the B&O did have records on them, so I was able to do it. Some of them almost seem apocryphal. Again, the same kind of paint scheme, the same solid green with the number over the trucks and the name replacing dining car underneath of the center. A couple of little things to notice. Roller bearing trucks are on this car. They were not delivered with roller bearing trucks. This is actually an F4BM. This was the first major renovation of the cars. You notice it's been air conditioned. You can tell that by the vent on the roof. Unfortunately, most of the equipment that you could pick out for the air conditioning is on the other side, some underneath the car and some in one of the vestibules where they used a cooling tower in the earliest York. There will be a section in this book. We chose this book to discuss the development of the York air conditioning, which was almost a B&O exclusive. The only other railroads that I found that used York air conditioning were the Chicago and Alton. So easy to know because it was done in the 30s. And then one or two cars on some other affiliated railroads. Central New Jersey had a couple of them. Just seems the B&O influence was very strong. B&O also, although I can't document this, I'm pretty sure that the B&O owned part of the York ice conditioning systems. This was a mechanical system. This was not ice, but they used to put what York used to make before air conditioning were ice machines to make artificial ice. Let's go ahead. This number 1035, this is an F4BA, a car built with the Colonial Service. But when the B&O decided to modernize the Capital Limited, they didn't go to their oldest colonial diners. They went to a couple that were in a little better condition and converted two of them, both with their colonial names. And in the beginning, they retained the windows from the first original pattern. They did seal the windows. They sealed them so they couldn't be opened. But they didn't immediately go to this presentation. The car has full skirts. The skirts didn't last very long. In the mid-40s, the B&O was cutting it out first right over the wheel wells so that the trucks had a little more movement and they could do a little bit tighter radius than they used to be able to. And then ultimately took them off altogether, as we'll see. So this would be like mod 1 of the Capital Limited car. Andrew? This is the same car later. Notice the modern roof is the same as it was. I mean, it's still a higher roof than the later cars had, but the skirting is completely gone with the exception of just at the very ends over the safety equipment. Done because they were just such a maintenance headache. Here you do get a look. That's the York air compressor. That's sort of shinier door in the middle. And the condenser is up closer to the truck. There's two condensers in these cars. One on each side. Andy? Now this car, I put in this spot, not only because I was rushing. This is car 2024, which is a cafe parlor car. It was originally a dining car, but was converted by the B&O. You will find that we will have a very extensive discussion in this book about the conversion of diners to cafe cars back to diners. In many cases, the only difference, they still kept their same kitchens. The difference was that there was usually a divided section that were other than the table. So there would be a smaller dining room and either a lounge or parlor car seating. The idea was you could run first-class service that required both dining car and parlor service in one car. Basically done around the demand. Dining car food was not very reasonable. It was expensive. And no dining car on any railroad that I've ever studied made any money on diners. They lost money big time. That's why they had to make it up with their mail revenues and head end equipment, because they had to balance those books somehow. They never did, but they tried. To B&O's credit or possible problem, they never gave up on the dining car till the very end of it. When the Capital Limited ran for the very last time in 1980, in April of '81, there were still dining facilities on that train, not a dedicated dining car, but there were still dining facilities. Hey, Andrew. This is 20. That's a mistake on my part. That's actually 2025, which was a sister car to the 2024, but showing it as having a slightly different configuration. Same basic car inside. As they went through the shops at Mount Clair to be modernized, a bit different. The windows are smaller, straight cut along the side sill there. Again, you can see the air conditioning equipment underneath. Andrew. Gotta look myself. I'm going to, rather than make a false statement, I'm going to say I don't remember what this car is, but I will look it up and make sure that it's annotated. In this, the best thing I can talk about on here is the 3 kitchen windows. Notice they're very long and very short. Basically figured that the dining car, the chefs didn't need a whole lot of time to look out the window. The reason for the vents was pretty obvious. The air conditioning was in the dining room. It was not in the kitchen. And these cars got beastly hot when they were being run. Since you can no longer open the windows, you would open those vents. See all the vents up on the top of the car, and look how congested they are right over the kitchen. That's an attempt to set up an air distribution center or system that would keep the kitchen habitable, keep from cooking the cooks. Go ahead, Andrew. I wanted to take, this picture's in here for a couple of reasons. First of all, you probably can tell that that's a photocopy. You can read the scrawls up, that's the Colonel's writing. That's because we identified a photo that we didn't have. But because we were able to capture the image, we found out that this photo is in Bill House's collection, and Bill has agreed to make the photos available to us. Bill was a longtime member of the society and a very, very supportive character. So we will be getting that picture in when I send the list down to Bill of what I need from him. And the caption obviously will be worked into a regular caption, but that's a placeholder, and they're throughout the collection. Andy? That was on the Capital Limited, by the way. This particular picture here is in the format that will actually show it. You notice a couple sitting at a table with a circular settee that they're sitting on. When the dining cars were converted for the national limit. There was not as heavy a demand for meal service at all times. So they took part of the dining room and converted it into a cocktail lounge. And you can get a view there that there are a couple of cocktails on the table. You were able to get served food there, quite evident. They do feature the Centennial China, as well as the Reed and Barton silver teapot and sugar bowl set. Those were plate, they're not stainless, or they're not sterling silver. But the B&O had many hundreds of them on service. Go ahead, Andrew. This car, again, I'm trying to focus on interiors for you to give you an idea. This is actually the dining section of one of the two only lightweight dining cars that the B&O ever bought. This was the Pittsburgh and the Akron, the F10 series cars. And the brand new theory of changing or modernizing the look. Remember, these cars were built in 1949. So they picked up a little bit of the Art Deco, and they picked up some of the theories that restaurants were using at the time. Normally, a two-top table would be one person facing the other. But in this case, they put it in as almost triangular. It does have some curves to it, where each person has her own place on the settee, but the table can be shorter than a normal square table that would be in that situation, to give the wait staff a little bit more room to move back and forth. This was the only car built new for the B&O, one of two, built new for the B&O, and it was a lightweight car. All right, Andrew. The car you're looking at here, I put this photo in here for a couple of reasons. First, you all can certainly see the pinholes forming 4443. That is a Montclair shop number. When the Montclair shops did a major project on virtually all of the equipment, but especially in the passenger cars, they would punch those holes into the negatives. It kept you from losing the identity of the photo, but it also makes it very difficult to reproduce a photo without them. In fact, it can't be done. So you will see that creeping in and out from time to time. This is one of the national limited dining cars. This car was based on the F4Cs as opposed to the F4Bs. This is a second modernization. The first one, the kitchen windows were a bit bigger, and then they shrunk them down. Also, you can see the skirt here. In 1940, when these were built, they had the same straight skirts as the Capital Limited cars. But in order to maintain the trucks, to work on them, to dig the snow and ice and sleet out of them when they ran through the heavy winters, they cut these holes in the skirting. That probably lasted for about 5 to 7 years, and they just cut away the skirts altogether.
Joe,
Yes, sir.
why the heavy piece there right before the end of the car?
Oh, what I'm assuming that Ray is referring to is the full width diaphragm. Normally, I think most of you are aware that a car has a folding bellows on the end of it with spring action, so that the folding bellow will be stretched. When cars couple, springs are weak enough that they compress, and then as the slack goes in and out of the draft gear, the bellows can go in and out with it. In the early applications, of which this is one, the edge of the foam area was covered with a strip of sheet metal, and the sheet metal got painted right into the paint scheme. You can see that right there. This was another attempt to show modernization and streamlining. We'll also cover in here a bit that Daniel Willard was very opposed to lightweight cars. He just did not like lightweight cars. He said they didn't ride right. He had pioneered having two trains, the Royal Blue and the Abraham Lincoln on the Alton, that were built of lightweights, one of aluminum and one of Corten steel. And every time he rode it up or down the corridor where they were used, he complained about the ride. So the B&O stuck with six-wheel trucks. That's the public relations answer. I think the accountants had something to say about it too. Lightweight cars were quite expensive. They were just coming out in the very late 30s, and the richer railroads could obviously fill Pullman's books, as well as Budd, who was by then manufacturing stainless steel cars. Ultimately, the outer part of that diaphragm was cut away, leaving just the bellows in the middle. And so they rode like any other passenger car. Andrew? This was the first modernization of the F4CC, that is the National Limited cars. You notice that they didn't really take the posts, the window posts are still heavy riveted steel. They didn't try to smooth them out at all. They just took out the old wood framed windows and put a sealed window frame surrounding thermopainting in its place. Very little major difference to it at all. Now this car looks like it's about to the point where the 1940 skirts have already been cut back, and this may very well be what it's done. I'll look in the Montclair file and see if we can find the purpose of this particular modification. But we don't have a date on this photo. Clearly that is Montclair, the cupola up in the air, dead giveaway. Andrew? This is the F4C car, shown as it was originally delivered. You'll notice it looks very much like the F4B, except for the window framing. And this car still has its plain variants. It hasn't been roller variant yet. So that's an original F4C right there. Andy just turned into Nick. I showed you that car because that car was retired and became B&O X 4045. And that car has a history all to itself. Notice that right here, it's still in the original green paint. It still has basically the same scheme, only the number has gone away. And this is that former car. Former car was when it was in service, the former slide. That was when it was in service. Thank you, Nick. This is where it went into maintenance of way service. You'll hit it once more, Nick. This particular renovation right here, you see the car is being painted B&O blue. The roof is painted aluminum. The main reason for those aluminum roofs were the air conditioning were taken out. And in these dining cars that had the sealed windows, that meant those things were ovens. And so when the crews that were using this train, and I'll look up and have not as yet, what service this car was in at the time, they put the aluminum paint on top to try to keep the car a bit cooler. That's the South Car Shop there behind it at the B&O Museum now, which is part of the exhibit space at this point. This is the area of Montclair where most of the passenger car renovations and rebuildings were done. Other smaller repairs were done out at Washington, Indiana, and a couple of other points on the B&O. Okay, Nick. went back again. All right, the car I'm showing you here, this is a transition, and please understand, this is just a representative sample of what we intend to do with this book. This is the 1083. This car still exists at the Museum as a preserved car. It still has its interior. Doesn't have much of its exterior, but it's still got its interior. This car was actually rebuilt from a colonial diner. Enough renovation was done that they determined to give it a whole new class. This is a 1954 car. Yes, 1954 car. And it was done to replace the 1938 cars that were running in the Capital Limited at the time. They needed to get both of those cars retired, so they took a newer colonial diner and completely renovated it. And you'll see if you look at that closely that all the rivets are gone. They were all shaved down. There was a great deal of welding done on the sides to emulate a lightweight car. It's still got its high roof that's typical of the heavyweights. Where is this one at? Has roller bearings. And in most service, this car really looked like the cars that were being put out by this point by the Pullman company. And as I say, it still exists. Okay, Nick. This is its sister, 1084. Why put both of them in this little overview? Because this one was built from an F4D. Again, F4C. So one colonial diner, one contemporary but not colonial diner, and they're virtually identical. So those cars were, the modernized B&O diner is either the F4B or the F4C. Some ramification and rebuilding, that was the backbone of the fleet. They were all built by the Pullman company. They gave yeoman service. Okay. We're dropping back in time a bit here. This is the 1082. This car and its sister car, 1081, were also former F4 class series. When they were redone for the 1941 Columbia. After the Capital Limited was streamlined in 38, and the National Limited, those the two premier trains in 1940. Then in 1941, they took the Columbian, which was at that time a New York to Washington train, and they rebuilt those cars and added some new cars, new rebuilt cars, to make an identical second set. And these became the overnight cars in the basically the Washington to Chicago route. Frequently, the timetables continued to show the Columbian as serving New York, but actually it was a Columbian style car put on one of the messenger trains that came down between New York and Washington almost every hour. And in fact, the same connecting train brought the Capital Limited cars and the Columbia cars in the same concepts. And then at Washington Terminal, they broke them. This was the more modern approach. This was actually the F10, that's the Akron, built for the 1949 Columbia. Ultimately, these replaced the 1083 and 1084 in Capital Limited services after all the trains on the Chicago line, well, not all the trains, but the Capital Limited, the Columbian, and the Ambassador were all put into the same train set. Finally, this is one of the twin unit diner sets. These were actually Chesapeake and Ohio cars, ordered by the Chesapeake and Ohio by Mr. Young. Mr. Young kind of overguessed the appeal of trains for the 1940s he ordered enough cars to completely replace the heavyweight on the C&O. And then there was no call for it. So right after he left, C&O began a used car business and sold over half of the cars that he had ordered to other railroads. These went to the New York Central. And the New York Central ran 2 pair of them. A 1950, I'm not going to lie to you, during the 1950s, the B&O bought them from the New York Central. I think it was as late as 57. 57? Thank you. The car on the left is a dining room car. It also has a small cocktail lounge in it. The car in front of it was the kitchen and also a dormitory. If you look at the other side of that car, you'll see fewer windows. I guess that was my key to leave.
I was hoping there was another side of the car.
No, there's not there. We do have some other photos, but as I say, I put this together real quick. Otherwise, you had to just sit and look at me, and I think everybody might have left. This is the preview. This is what the dining cars or the food service cars of the Baltimore and Ohio should look like. We are pushing diligently to try to have the manuscript proofed and ready by the end of the year. And the top photographic materials, they're coming along as quick as they can. Mike Williams, now here, has spent his last couple of weeks digitizing the collections of Ralph Barger and William Barringer. We've also digitized those portions of Dr. Harry Stegmeyer's files that we inherited. Unfortunately, his estate was broken up among several places, but we've got some things from him, and I've got stuff coming up from Bill House. I do, however, for all of you, put out a plea, and that is if you have decent and in your mind publishable photographs that you're willing to share, if you can digitize them or copy them or any other way, and let us have them, let us have access to them and permission to print them, because we're still a little short on photographs. Most especially, I want a very nice color, blue and gray dining car on the cover of that book. Right now, it's going to be one of the 2 cafe lounge cars, the 2024 or the 2025. It's the only one that I've got a really good photo. I've got a good one of the 1083, but its vestibule is chopped off. And I know my photo editor, she's not going to go for that. She's going to tell me, you can't put that on a cover. What's wrong with it? I know this because this is what she said about, in Baltimore 2019. She's a good, great photo editor, and I'm very happy to have her on our team as well. That's it. I know I went over. I would have done better had I followed my original script, but it didn't match the presentation.
Joe, you have a moment for a question from John Teichel?
Of course.
John asks if you can comment on the workmanship of the Mount Clair shops versus the commercial builders.
That's a very good question, John. In general, they were quite equal. The Mount Clair shops certainly had the capability of matching any manufacturer. The question that would come up would be the state of the finances at the time they were doing the remodeling or the rebuilding, and what could they afford, what would the budget be for some of these projects. As far as the actual hands-on riveting, welding, renovations, rebuilding up the center sills to the extent that they could be rebuilt, yet they'd be very cautious about doing that. The Mount Clair workmanship was first class. Cincinnati and Train certainly pointed that out. They were 2 very, very fine train sets, all built from old B&O A18s and a couple of, I think the baggage car diner was basically a D15. They had recommended.
Yes, you say something about the observation diners on the Cincinnati. Were those the only diners that were of that sort?
Yes, they were, those two cars were built for the Cincinnatian. Remember, the Cincinnatian was built for a daylight run, Washington to Cincinnati. So the demand for food service would be different. I'm not saying less, but different than those where the night sleepers, like the Capitol and the National, they pretty much had to serve dinner in the evening and then be ready for breakfast in the morning. Another fact that'll come out when we write this monumental work is that diners were frequently cut in and cut out of trains. A diner might go from Washington to Cumberland and be cut out, and it might have been on a Chicago-based train, and it'd be cleaned and serviced in Cumberland and ready for breakfast and put on a St. Louis-based or a Cincinnati train. We have got some pretty good work that was done by our then archivist, Mr. Fiegel, sitting sleeping in the back, excuse me, on the pool service and how these diners were swapped out at different terminals. So that will definitely be part of it if I can find a clean copy of it to work from. Is that it? Thank you very much. I hope I didn't- Thank you, sir.
We will take a 5-minute break. Just 5 minutes, stretch your legs. I know lunch is probably weighing on you a little bit, eyelids. And then Greg will start with his presentation on a book on the piano models that are available both steam and diesel. Yes. Okay, good. I'm going to turn it over to the front. Thank you very much.
But then move it from
The
that room to this
Oh,
room.
you would just.
And
Greg's going to be on this one.